Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. Today, once more, with our friend and colleague, Evarist Bartolo, a former foreign minister of the beautiful island nation of Malta. Evarist, welcome back.
Welcome, and thank you very much for this conversation.
Evarist, you actually told me that March, which we are in at the moment, is a month for you in Malta to actually commemorate something important, and that's the closure of the last foreign bases on Malta. And we will talk about this in the context, of course, of the Iran war. But can you maybe give us a little bit of the background of why Malta was at bases in the first place of other nations and how it was able to close them?
Yes, end of March is for us important because on the 31st of March 1979, the British left their naval and military bases that they had in Malta since 1800. But that wasn't the first time that Malta served as a base for the powers that were, trying to compete with each other for dominance. They considered Malta to have a strategic, important place below Sicily. What interested them more than the geographic location was that there is an all-year weather deep harbor, which was obviously very, very important. That has been our blessing, but also our curse because of the deep harbor where we have been dominated for thousands of years. So it's not just the British base. And in our history, I guess we've been invaded about 24 times. And we've always been invaded not because of something that we did or because we, as natives, constituted a threat, but because the power that held Malta as a base was obviously a threat to other powers in the region. So for us, we've been for the first time not serving as a military base now since 1979. So in our 8,500 years of history, it's in the last 8 minutes or so, if we were to compact our history into 24 hours, we've been without a military base and free of military bases for the last 8 minutes, I would say. What is interesting is that in 1987, we managed to get a constitutional change, and both major parties in Malta have committed themselves not to join Malta, not to join any military alliance, and not to let our territory to serve as foreign military bases for other powers.
This is very important. Malta is a neutral country, but under the current foreign policy thinking of much of the establishment in the West, anyone would expect that you will be overrun by military forces, either by the Russians or the Chinese. I mean, you have no protection. I mean, who protects Malta? Um, can you explain to me a little bit how the Maltese think about their security in their neighborhood?
This is the biggest, the rhetoric is the biggest problem, I would say, because there is the perception that if you don't have someone to protect you, you will be invaded. Whereas in fact, history shows that we've always been invaded because we served as a military base for others. On our own, we cannot threaten others, and that is very good because we do not constitute a threat. I think what is very important for us, what has been very important for us, is to deny ourselves as a military base to everyone and not to align ourselves with one bloc or another. What is interesting, and I find more people today ready to accept this argument, is what is happening obviously now in the war against Iran, where military bases are not security umbrellas, but actually lightning rod, actually magnets to attract missiles, to attract war. Instead of protecting you, actually you need to be protected from these military bases. So this is something, I think, one of the unintended consequences, I think, of the war against Iran is that it is making people worldwide. I don't think it's happening dramatically, but I'm sure that even from what I follow, more people are now ready to accept that I also follow what's happening in Cyprus, for example, that more people now are ready to accept that having foreign military bases on your territory is not a security umbrella, but actually a magnet to cause problems for you, not just militarily, but I think also politically and economically.
A lightning rod is a very good way of putting it because, in a sense, what the Qataris and Bahrain and Kuwait are now getting is they're getting the blitz from the Iranians as a retaliation against the U.S. and against Israel. Although these Gulf states are not themselves attacking Iran, but because they host the bases of the people who attack, well, you become automatically a target. I mean, it's the most natural thing in the world, even if Donald Trump keeps claiming that nobody could have foreseen that something like this would happen. Do you think that this situation is now actually also in these places going to make people rethink the security strategy? I mean, we've seen a lot of comments coming out of Saudi Arabia that they are thinking of joining the war instead of actually doing the opposite of saying like no more bases, and Qatar and Kuwait and so on, they're all condemning these actions against them. But don't you think that behind the scenes, some of these foreign policy people, especially the foreign ministers, must be realizing that the cause of their destruction now is actually that very, very mistaken foreign policy of thinking that by providing bases you automatically get security?
I think so, and it is very clear that even what is happening in Asia, let- let's focus a bit on what's happening even in South Korea, where the base is supposed to be there to protect them from China. Whereas, in fact, if equipment is needed to protect the US and Israel, you bring it over from South Korea. So it's very clear that these military bases, and let's remember, Pascal, that at the moment there are about 1,247 military bases around the world. Over 800 of them, 90%, belong to the United States. And as the NATO Secretary General told us recently about NATO, but what he said about NATO applies also to military bases, is not to defend the host countries where these bases are placed, but actually to project a global military power. So instead of protecting you, you get involved now in the global conflicts that a great power like the United States has, and it has very, very deep, painful consequences for the countries that are hosting them. And I can tell you, even from my personal experience, I know some of these not just ministers, but even at a higher level in the Gulf countries, how they talk publicly and then how they talk privately to you when you ask them these questions that you've just asked. Do you think that the bases are here to protect you, or are they actually becoming a danger and a big risk for you? And publicly, although even now they are careful on how to pronounce themselves, publicly they would say, oh, they're good, it's a part of the security architecture in our region. But they know that privately it's actually there to control them rather than to protect them, and that it exposes them to serious problems, even economically. And because, especially if you take countries like Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, are small, the consequences can be felt across the territory. It's not something which can be an enclave on its own, and especially I can tell you, Pascal, even from our own historical experience, when Malta was serving as a military base, for many years, all our territory was under the control of the War Department in Britain. It wasn't even of the Overseas Department. So, whatever civil infrastructure project needed to be done to pass a road, to extend the water connection, to have electricity, to build something, you needed the go ahead of the War Department. How does this affect the military interests of the UK in Malta? If it goes against the interests of the UK in Malta, strategically, militarily, then that project would not happen. It is no wonder that in our case, tourism industry and the services sector started developing when we stopped being a military base, because finally there was space, not just physical space and territorial space for these developments, but also finally decision-making space of how to take decisions in the interest of your people. And I think this is something which needs to be explained over and over again, Pascal. And there is no need to be even from the global south to understand this. I think if we see what happened 60 years ago, literally in March of 60 years ago, President Charles de Gaulle told the United States to close down its naval and military bases and their bases in France, not only because he wanted to regain national sovereignty, which was very, very important, but because he actually felt that it interfered with the decision making of France, not just militarily, but really as part of running your country in your own interest.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. Yeah, I mean, these military alliances, especially when they're so asymmetrical, right? Between a very large power and a very small one, like the large United States and the small UAE and the small Qatar, or the large UK and the small Malta. These are not alliances. These are, of course, colonial colonial relationships. And actually, for Malta, Malta was a colony of the UK, right? Even it was treated as one until it then received its independence. But why do you think it is that this is coming under stress now, this whole strategy? I mean, the decolonial process, at least since 1945, was at least in theory supposed to go there. And we know that, like, let's say in the UAE and so on, in the Gulf states, there was this idea of a quid pro quo, right? Security for bases and basically submission to what this foreign power actually wants. We know that the same logic is true in Japan, and this is not a secret, not a theory. I mean, the 1953 Security Treaty, which first established that the US could open bases, and then the revision in 1960, the one that's still in force now, very clearly said, okay, US, you get bases, in return we get security, and we don't, the Japanese, I mean, get security, and they can then focus on economic development instead of military development, which served kind of both sides. And that was it. And that actually worked, at least for Japan, and arguably also for the Gulf states for a while. But now it became a liability, and I am absolutely sure it will become a liability for Japan as well. It will become a liability for the Philippines. Do you think that what's currently happening, do you think this will serve as a signal to these other states to actually look again at the strategy, or will it just entrench the idea that we need even more US bases in order to deter the other one?
No, I think deep questions are being asked, and they will increase I think for at least three reasons, both militarily, politically, and economically. So something which is happening, which I think is very, very interesting, and as far as I know, this hasn't been pointed out so far, is that the missile technology and the drone technology that Iran has developed is actually making these bases obsolete,
Right.
because they are like anchored aircraft carriers on land. And we know that the US is keeping its aircraft carriers and its navy far away from Iran because of the missile and drone technology. Now, this is very interesting, because I think this is a new development, and I'm sure that even militarily, even those who are in favor of war and those who make money out of war will have to rethink the presence of military bases for the very simple reason that they've now become very vulnerable to drones and missile technology, both hypersonic and ballistic. And it is cheaper to attack military bases than to defend them. So what is interesting now is that the drones and the missiles that Iran is using at a cheaper cost, much cheaper cost than what the US has, actually makes it, I repeat, cheaper to attack these military bases, and they are more vulnerable than to defend them. You take away the radar system. As I said, they are like navies berthed in a port, which makes them very vulnerable. This is interesting, Pascal, because it makes me think of a very important essay written by George Orwell, which probably is not known a lot. This was in October 1945, and it's called "The Atom Bomb and You." And he makes this reflection, which I think is worth really thinking about, that the history of civilization, unfortunately, is the history of the development of armaments, the history of the development of weapons. And he says when weapons are very expensive to produce, they also produce despotic systems. When you have cheaper weapons that can take on constituted powers, they serve as, and in his beautiful phrase, as giving claws to the weak, that the weak have a way of striking back. And I'm seeing that this is happening in the Gulf. So it is easier today, and even in Cyprus, to show that actually military bases do not protect you, but make you very vulnerable, and you have to pay the price. And in this case, interesting that before the war against Iran, President Trump was actually telling the Gulf countries, listen, these bases are not charitable institutions. You must pay for them. So now imagine if you go to them and tell them after you have involved them in a war which they didn't want, you're going to tell them not only are you suffering the consequences, but now you have to pay for these bases which are actually a threat not only to your sovereignty, but to your security and to your prosperity. So I think the worldwide, this is going to be a strong argument about rethinking of the military bases. Also, I think the economic reality is very important. Let's keep in mind that the British Empire had to withdraw from a lot of its military bases, eventually even including Malta, because they couldn't afford them anymore. Now, how long is the United States going to keep on spending $80 billion at least a year to keep these bases? I'm not talking about the war effort and how much the war is costing in Iran. I mean, it's the amount of money that is being spent for a country that has over $39 trillion deficit and debt, I mean, and a deficit of around 6%. How long is the United States going to afford to have these military bases? So I think the pressure will be on. It will not happen from one day to the next, but I think the pressure will be on for a rethinking and reevaluation of military bases worldwide.
We have seen this over centuries, especially of European naval warfare, time and again, and exactly the thing that's happening right now. And the thinking based upon which Malta actually tried to chase away the UK and close all bases is the reason why we in international law actually have an entire body of law called the law of neutrality, which precisely for this one says that no, if you cannot, if you want to claim neutrality, you cannot aid one of the militaries, you cannot host it, you cannot have bases, and your even your telecommunication infrastructure, according to the Hague Conventions, cannot be used for them, because if you open it to one of the other of the two parties, naturally the other one will shoot at you. Naturally. And actually that's this logic is so well understood that it is even encoded in the Hague in the Hague Conventions. because it's so blatantly obvious, right, that that's what's happening. But for some reason, we managed over the course of the Cold War and then into the 30 years of unipolarity, managed to overwrite that with a logic that's just not right. That just doesn't work. That these bases then produce so much security. And the points uh, that you just raised are very, very important. My question to you, also as somebody who worked uh, with people from the Gulf and in as a policy professional, as a foreign minister, what do you think? How long will it take until the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, maybe even Saudi Arabia will, behind the scenes, try to start talking to the Iranians? Because we have seen this before. Some people made the argument that the proxy states, US proxies, they are just vassals. And yes and no, because we know from the Vietnam War that that President Diem of South Vietnam actually had secret negotiations with Ho Chi Minh in the north, and was actually on the way to try to create some form of South Vietnamese neutrality or some kind of like framework in order to allow the fighting to end. And this was one of the reasons why the United States signed off on his assassination by his own generals. But so the we know that at some point the proxies will try to figure something out, and I just wonder if you have a hinge, a hunch for whether the Gulf states might already try to somehow signal to Iran that they would be willing to change this relationship, if just the fighting stops, or how do you see it?
I have no doubt that talks are going on behind the scene informally, but it varies with different countries. So you can't say this about all countries because the different countries in the Gulf have different relations with Iran. It's
Mhm.
one thing talking about Oman, for example. I have no doubt that contacts are going on. I don't have any doubt, though I don't have any proof, that talks would be going on between Qatar and Iran. They have very good relations. Not all of them are public and not all of them are talked about. Even Kuwait, different when it comes to the Emirates, I would say, and also to a certain extent to Saudi Arabia. Though something which I used to find very interesting when I used to ask them confidentially and privately, talking to my colleagues. So, how are you managing your relations with the US, with China, with Russia at the same time? Do you have pressure to really align yourself in everything regarding one power against another power? And they, at that point, it was still possible for them that you could have good economic relations with China, but then have a security arrangement, what was called a security arrangement with the United States. And they used to tell them, listen, we need to sell our oil, we need to sell our LNG, we need to import things. And the US cannot obviously satisfy all these different needs. And it was possible. Now, I think this is becoming more possible in a multipolar world. So that is another political reason why I think the pressure to change the model of military bases and the military network today will change. I think there will be less military bases in the future, even in the Gulf, which doesn't necessarily mean that the control that a great power like the United States would still try to exercise in the area, but it would do it in a different way. Obviously, when it comes to the Emirates, it's different, Pascal. Pascal, the relationship between the Emirates and Israel is symbiotic. It goes much more.
Really?
It goes much more than the Abraham Accords. If you were to study the shares that companies in the Emirates have in the military industrial complex of Israel, you would be shocked.
Really?
So,
I
yeah,
I thought they were like, okay, not on the level of Qatar, obviously, but they were highly critical of Israel. But so
No, 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 no. The interests are actually embedded. And if you were to visit the armaments fair that there was in February this year in the Emirates, you wouldn't know whether it was being held in Tel Aviv or in Dubai. They are so close, and they invest in the companies, in the war, in the military industrial complex of Israel. So no, 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 that is different. That's why I said it wouldn't apply to everyone. When it comes to Saudi, um, it will be a bit more complex, but I also think that the Saudis, and that is why the relationship that China tried to build between Iran and Saudi, there were those who wanted to disrupt it. Because something that I noticed when we have discussion recently, I participated in a very interesting discussion called Multipolarity and the Gulf region. This was weeks before, obviously, this happened. Interesting that you would have people in the area feeling resentful against China, that China is not behaving like the United States. They want China to come in and behave like the United States, fight the United States, and build this kind of relationship with the different countries in the Gulf, like a superpower dictating to lesser powers what to do. China will not do that.
which side
Doesn't-
did say that? Was that somebody from the region, or were this people from
Yes,
the region,
yes,
or that were that like this is
yes,
something like very European that I could imagine?
yes, but from the region, but for diplomats from the region who were actually telling the Chinese, there were some very top diplomats from China taking part, telling them, "But you are so quiet, you are so withdrawn. Why aren't you like the United States?" And I had to come in and actually say, "Listen, please, I think one United States is enough. We don't need more United States with different names."
Yeah,
So, and it was quite painful for the Chinese to actually to explain to them that they do not want to be like the United States, that they want, yes, to build relations, commercial relations, trade relations, but they will not come in to tell them, do this, do that, and you're either with us or against us.
I had a very interesting conversation at the beginning of the week with Sheng Zhang. He's a young Chinese scholar and actually a Middle East West Asia expert, studying the Chinese relationship. And he explained to me, look, China actually has a good relationship with Iran. I mean, it was not perfect, but it's improving, and it has a good relationship with the Gulf states, and it wants that good relationship with both of them because the oil imports are actually quite important, and the trade relationships are important. And China has how he explained it, kind of a Dengish side, the Deng Xiaoping kind of a trade related
Yeah.
side, and hide your time, bide your strength and hide your strength and bide your time. And the other one, the more Maoist kind of more pro-revolutionary and pro-interventionist side, but they're condemned to coexistence, and China cannot be convinced, I mean, from the system to actually become a United States. So that's out of the question. Um, so in this sense, like
No,
China actually might be had time.
I personally think, I don't know whether I overdo this point, but personally think from history that even if you were to look at colonialism, no, where the movement from the West to go to Latin America and to go to other areas, 300 years before, there were Chinese explorers who were doing the same, who were going towards the east, coming towards Africa. They never traveled with an army. They did not travel with arms. They traveled for trade. And wherever they settled or, touched base, it was actually to carry out trade. I think it's part of their civilization that this is how they want to be in their engagement with the rest of the world. It's trade, not to dominate. and not to dominate. I definitely do not agree with, dividing the world into angels and devils. We're all human beings, and we all have our interests, and we all try to do the best for us. But I do believe that there is a kind of culture of dominance in the West, which we don't find in other civilizations. And I think that I really hope, and actually, in one of the discussions I had in Shanghai, when I was invited to address a meeting of the Shanghai CSO in Shanghai, I said, please read Animal Farm at the end, when the pigs overthrow the human beings. And at one point, you can't tell who are the pigs and who are the human beings. And I said, please do not become like those that, are dominating the world. Have a different presence. I don't think they needed my my words, but I think it is different, and it is interesting to see how these different countries now will develop their relations with India, with Russia, with China, with Brazil. I'm sure, and obviously a new kind of relationship with Iran. And these countries make it a point. It's not that they want to be against any other country. They would like, I'm sure of what I'm telling you, they would like to have relations with as many different countries as possible, and with as many different powers as possible. It's the United States that imposes on them what to do and who to align with and who to follow, which is themselves.
Mhm. The biggest threat to these, also especially island nations, but we can count in the Gulf states as island nations because they're basically surrounded either by water or by sand, actually emanates from the strongest part in any kind of great power rivalry. And there is this very, very telling precedent in the Peloponnesian War, actually. The very famous dictum: the
Yeah.
strong do what they want, and the weak suffer what they must. The strong do what they
Yes.
can, and the weak suffer what they must. That is actually from the Melian dialogue. And the
Yes.
dialogue
Yes.
is the story of Melos, that island, that the Athenians went there and told them, you either join the war with us against Sparta, or we gonna kill you. And then they
Yeah.
rejected and said, no, we don't want to. And actually gave a beautiful definition of neutrality. Wouldn't it be better if we were friends to you and foe to none? And the Athenians rejected that. The Athenians said, like, no, either our ally and war with us against Sparta, or you die. And then, of course, they come back and kill them. But the Malians said, like, no, we want to have the right to be a kind of to not be an enemy to anyone. So, actually, do you think that there might be a threat to any kind of nation that tries to wiggle free out of this alliance obligation to go to war with or for the United States, that they would come under threat from the United States if they tried to do so?
They always try to keep you within their sphere. I wouldn't say sphere of influence, but sphere of control. And it's interesting that even if we were to look at what was happening after the setting up of first NATO and then the Warsaw Pact, those alliances, rather than serving against each other or to check each other, they were actually serving to control the members of the bloc. And that is why, for example, de Gaulle felt that he had to tell NATO and the United States to get out of France, because he wanted France to have room where to maneuver and to be in charge of its own destiny and its own decision-making process. Look at Italy. I am sure, and I can tell you from even personal experiences, would you believe it that Italy would have been happy to be a neutral country and not to be part of NATO? But they were locked into the bloc. One of the reasons, I'm sure that one of the reasons why left, even right, even center left, center right politicians in Italy helped Malta to become neutral, because we were a bit their superego. They loved what we were doing because they wanted to do it themselves. A kind of relationship with the Arab world, with the Mediterranean, with Africa, trying to be friends with everyone instead of being logged into one block. But the Americans wouldn't allow them to do that, and that is why they meddled a lot in Italian politics. I would say even to the extent of taking out people like Moro, who wanted Italy to have a more presence, which is not the presence of a vassal, which is not the role of a vassal, but the role of a sovereign country, which again doesn't want to be against the United States, but wants to have also good relations at that time with the Soviet Union, with China, with Africa, with the Arab world. But yes, they don't like that. Now, if you go to the Soviet Union, the same thing was happening when it comes to Hungary, when it comes to Prague. You invade them to ensure that you discipline them and keep them in the block. So yes, great powers will try to do all they can to keep you under their control.
Yeah, but the that observation that you made about the costs of these bases is actually something that might change this calculus.
Yes,
Not
I think so.
obviously not in Europe. I mean, I am pretty sure the US is willing to go a very, very long way, including using violence against the greatest threat to NATO, which is not Russia. Russia is actually very convenient in the narrative. The greatest threat is neutralism. If these
Yeah.
countries suddenly get, if somebody suddenly gets the idea, hey, how about I just leave the bloc, not join Russia, but just leave the bloc, that would be devastating for anyone who would like seriously try to attempt to do that from the side of NATO. Of course, just as it was devastating for Imre Nagy. That he tried to take Hungary out of the Warsaw Pact. But in any event, do you think now that when it comes to the base question, that maybe the US itself will rethink how valuable they are? Then again, I mean, they're valuable in terms of being able to drag into a war another nation. I mean, for Japan, if the United States wanted to fight a war with China, seriously wanted to do it, all they need to make sure is that China somehow attacks a U.S. base on Okinawa, and almost naturally, Japan would have to join the war because it's an attack on their territory. So it's like in terms of power politics, the bases will continue to serve a function, won't they?
But I think the biggest problem actually are not the people of the military or those who draw up strategies for their countries, whether it's the United States, China, Russia. In the case of the United States, the biggest problem, I think, is the AI military industrial complex, because hardwired into its model is the need to sell as many products as possible, even if they don't make sense. I think that is the biggest problem that the United States faces. We've seen, even in the case of the Iran war, people in the military telling actually, the president and telling the US security establishment, this war doesn't make sense. But if the interests of the military industrial complex prevails, and I'm sure that they will try to keep as much as possible, as many bases as possible around the world, even if they don't make sense. For example, I'm sure that, and we've heard discussions about this. Uh, does it make sense to have an aircraft carrier today? Does it make sense to have these big naval ships, which have become so vulnerable to the new technology of drones and of missiles, both marine drones and also airborne drones? So even if the military technology should make the establishment in the US rethink on the trillions that it is spending, whether it is spending them wisely and to what extent does it make sense, we will see the same kind of pressure to keep on the existing model for a long time, even if it doesn't make sense, even if these bases do not make sense, even militarily. They will try to keep them. What I think will happen is that they will also try to change the model of engagement and also on how to keep control. Because I can tell you, Pascal, at the same time that in Malta we will be commemorating the closure of the UK base, I can tell you that there have been a lot of efforts from NATO, from the US especially, to keep Malta under control and to engage our small army and our security apparatus that we have in, for example, buying their software, in participating in training programs. That is also a soft way. That's a soft approach, but it still keeps you under control as well. So there are different forms of, of controlling countries.
Of course, and it's actually extremely sophisticated. I mean, the one thing we cannot accuse the United States of is of being uh, stupid about the way that they approach their global dominance. I mean, even also neutral Switzerland, how neutral it still is, even in the political sense, is debatable. But at least on paper, we are. They are happy to buy F-35s from the United States, which we know, it is known, it is not a secret, it is clearly communicated. If the US disagrees from Switzerland's army using the F-35, they will not be able to fly. So
Exactly.
we bought a car where the keys to the car are actually in Washington. The keys are not with us. And this
Again, again, Pascal, this is why de Gaulle wanted the keys in Paris, and not in Washington. What is important, what I think what is important in this area, Pascal, is then to discuss the use of economic coercion.
Yeah.
Because I know personally how the US uses its heavy hand in countries like Malta, even Switzerland. I was told regarding the Ukraine war, over there, the discussion with behind the scenes with the Swiss authorities was not about security. It was about, we will hurt your financial services. We will
Yes.
hurt your banking system if you do not follow our line. So there again, we need to have changes in the dominance of the dollar, in the dominance of the financial institutions. And if a multipolar world means also that there will be different institutions to manage the international financial situation. And if the economic coercion of the United States is weakened, then we can see a bit more freedom for maneuver of small, medium countries to manage their own destinies and not to be controlled by greater powers.
How did Malta do it? How did Malta wiggle itself out of the tight embrace of the UK and by extension of the whole NATO spiel? How did that happen? How did it succeed?
Well, historically, we have to pay tribute to a character like Dom Mintoff. Dom Mintoff, who was a prime minister for many years, but he was our Lee Kuan Yew, Pascal. He was a statesman. He loved Malta, and he was, Malta first and foremost. That was his slogan. So he used to be a very hard bargainer, very very hard, very difficult to negotiate with, and always kept tell kept the power that he was negotiating with. In this case, it was UK, NATO, and the US. Even if you see the classified documents of how Nixon and Kissinger were worried that Malta would fall under the sphere of influence, not of the Soviet Union, although that is what was said publicly, but of Libya. They were very worried that Gaddafi would manage to draw in Malta, and Malta would be an important outpost also for him if he wanted to hurt Europe. That is what they used to say. Mintoff knew that they were worried about this, and he used the Gaddafi card, I think, quite deftly. For example, I'll tell you an anecdote which is not known, I think. While he was negotiating with the UK, because it's interesting that NATO was in Malta without any formal agreement and without paying to be in Malta. They used to say the UK is in NATO, so if Malta is part of the UK, we have every right to be here and we don't need to pay. When Mintoff came to power in 71, he said, no, this has to change. You have to pay. Let's have a new defense agreement. It will be for 7 years. In fact, it was reached in March 72, so that by March 79, you will leave the country, and we promise that we will not allow anyone to set up or to replace you. While he was discussing this in London, he used to send his deputy prime minister to Tripoli. In the evening, they would have chats over the phone in Maltese, knowing full well that MI6 would be following these chats. From Tripoli, the deputy prime minister would keep on telling him, don't waste time with the British negotiating on these things. Gaddafi is willing to give you everything. Don't waste time. So Mintoff would go back and know me. Listen, and when I tell you this, the deputy prime minister hadn't discussed anything with Gaddafi. It was all bluff. So Mintoff in the morning would go there smiling and trying to drive a hard bargain. From the British side, he would be told, but you have something up your sleeve. Why are you pushing us to the brink? We're sure that Gaddafi is ready to give you money. And they would say no, 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 no. So he kept them guessing, and because of that, he drove a hard bargain. What was then very, very interesting, that once the negotiation was completed and he managed to get a much better agreement, and that they would leave by 1979, he was off to Beijing, at that time Peking. And that took them completely by surprise, because not even their intelligence people realized that he was making plans that after an agreement is reached, he would go to China. He didn't go to Moscow. He didn't go to Moscow because he didn't want, at no point did he want Malta to fall under the Soviet sphere of influence. But he went to China, and he went to China. Where China was ready to help, because he saw that China would be able to help, even though this was in the 70s, even if this was at the beginning of the 70s, and obviously China was not the power that it has become today. He knew that China would be able to help, and China has no fleet to come to Malta and invade it. So this was his approach of bargaining with different powers to get the best for Malta. I think it's a masterly approach, a very strategic approach. Unfortunately, such leaders are in low supply.
Extremely short supply these days. Uh, I if we could talk about this period, I mean, I would say Finland had a very similar one
Yes, yes,
with,
yes.
uh, what's his name? The Finnish
Iconic,
leader at the
no?
time. Kekkonen,
Was it
Kekkonen, Urho Kekkonen, yes, yes, Urho Kekkonen was doing a very similar thing, towards the
and
Soviets.
you had Olaf Palme, no? But
Yes, yeah, Olof Palme in Sweden,
and
yeah.
you had Brandt as well and even in Italy. And even in Italy, you had people like Moro
Yeah.
who had a different approach, no?
And yeah, and the
So
point is that over the last 50 years, I would say US, um, the US fostered kind of think tanks and foreign policy schools and da 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 and whatnot,
yes,
and
yes,
the WF. They managed to breed out those that
yeah,
kind of, even left wing sovereignist type of
yes, yes,
thinking of what's good for the nation. So we don't have that one anymore. But my question is, wouldn't what's currently happening encourage that some of these thinking comes back? Like let's take the example of Cyprus. Cyprus'
yeah,
greatest problem is that they still are a divided island, between two NATO allies, of course, right? Between basically the Greek side and the Turkish side. And then we also have to just to throw in more complications, UK bases over there, which are used by NATO and by extension by the United States. In proximity, direct proximity to Israel, Gaza, and therefore the entire Middle East, and they were struck by bombs. Don't you think that this will drive home somehow the point also to this kind of European outposts that, oh, we might have a bigger problem than we thought?
yes, because when the treaty to give Cyprus independence was negotiated in 1960,
Mm.
the condition for giving them independence was that at Akrotiri and Dekelia, they will have the sovereign bases, practically the size of Malta. I am, about 99 square miles, where it's not territory of Cyprus, but actually sovereign. But sovereign in the case of UK, not sovereign, obviously, for Cyprus. And those bases have been used, obviously, by the UK, by the US, have been used also for the genocidal war in Gaza. Israel is very strong in the Cypriot side of the republic. The drone attack has reignited discussion in Cyprus about the future of these bases. I don't know how much it will feature in the coming elections. In a few weeks' time, they will have elections over there. The Cypriot president, Christolides, has said everything is on the cards. We will discuss the future of our bases. I don't think he's the type of leader who would want the UK to leave. He's very close to Israel, very close to the EU leadership. So I don't see him as the kind of leader who would want to take Cyprus away from here. Obviously, there the situation is complicated by the fact that it's still divided, and you have bases of Turkey on one side and bases of the UK on the other side. But it is so sad because, again, Cyprus is not in a position to have a sovereign political decision-making process, because it is still occupied on both sides by foreign military bases, and as I said, that has implications for them which goes beyond the military sphere. Let's see whether there will be enough momentum to put that discussion on the. At one point, they were moving in the direction of Malta, of moving to get the bases out of there. But then you know that the coup d'etat was not just a Greek matter, but even Britain wanted Cyprus to remain subordinate to it. And they had a leader who was a visionary and a strategic leader in Makarios, Archbishop Makarios, who actually had to flee for his life. He actually came to Malta on his way, and because his dream was to have a neutral Cyprus, but he was pushed away. And what we see, I think, in the last 80 years was, yes, a decolonization process, but at the same time, a recolonization process in a different way, because we've seen thousands of bases closed down with the decline of the European empires, but then new bases coming up with the new empire. So you had these two forces, decolonization and recolonization. So,
Yeah.
history is not linear, and we know that change is difficult, but change happens as well.
Yeah, and the more it changes, the more it stays the same, right? And so, and of course, we understand that the United States had a huge interest in closing down the UK bases all around the world, and then come in and make basing agreements with the states that just kicked out the UK, right? Or then do cooperation. But it was important to replace that previous,
And
global.
what is amazing, Pascal, is if you look at the 20 or so countries in the world to have bases in other countries. Obviously, I said the US has 90% of them. The second country, which in terms of footprint still has a lot of presence, is the UK, yeah, still. And then, only then, do you have China. Oh, sorry, not even China. You have Russia, and then you have France. Then you have Turkey. Even Turkey is quite a strong presence. And then China has practically one in Djibouti, no? Which is
Yeah,
interesting, because
you
it's interesting what Djibouti has done. Djibouti has, instead of telling everyone get out, the Djibouti has told them come in. So
so
I think there is US, there is France, there is China, there is Italy. So that's interesting as well. That's a different model.
That's what happened in terms of the spy war during the Second World War. The
Yeah.
neutral Switzerland and Sweden, they didn't tell everybody get rid of take your spies out. They said like you wanna have your spies here at the at your embassies. Sure, anyone can come. Visas will be granted. Just give visas to
Yes, yes.
everybody, and we know that they're spying. Obviously, they do,
Yes.
which is actually a good thing. You know,
That is a
very important information sharing actually on
yes,
different levels.
yes, yes. Jai Shankar, the Indian foreign minister, calls that multi-alignment.
Yep.
It's not the non-alignment model, but it's to align yourself, actually, to have as many different friends and good relations as
Yeah.
possible, which
But but
makes sense.
but successful multi-alignment also demands that you're able to say not only yes to everybody, but also no to
No,
everybody, and they try to push you over the
exactly,
brink. I mean, you need to be able to do
exactly,
both. Um,
exactly.
one, and, there's just one more thing. I mean, I wonder how long it will take until this lesson is learned in a large part of the world, because the greatest crime, I would say, that we've seen when it comes to European politics is to make Ukrainian neutrality impossible. In 2014, it was not a pro-Russian Ukrainian president that was chased away; it was a pro-neutralist president, and you made it impossible that Ukraine would actually have a functioning neutrality, and hence it then became the battleground, the battlefield. And now we're seeing the same repeating with the Middle East in with a
Yeah,
different
that's
configuration, but you see it time and again how you make it impossible for these smaller then vassals to remain to keep a balance, right, and to function as buffers. I wonder how long it will take until this goes through in a lot of capitals.
Unfortunately, Pascal, visions and leadership are not, and even historical experience, are not inherited automatically.
Yep.
Every generation has to learn at its expense. And unfortunately, I think the new generations, even the new generations that I see in Europe, have not learned the historical lessons of the past. Also, because I think, unfortunately, and I say this sadly, they do not even know their own history. They do not even know their own past. So, how can you learn from the past if you don't know your past? And I'm talking this even about ministers and prime ministers who are in important positions of power and decision making, and they do not know the history of their country, so they have not learned from it.
Yeah, it's quite a fantastic moment, when a country run um by a real estate magnate then kills a philosopher leader of another country, and
Yeah.
you just the West is at the moment in such an infantile state that even the leadership is in an infantile state, and still the system itself manages to be big enough in order to create all of that death and destruction. It's a yeah.
Well, what I find terrifying, Pascal, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say this. It's as if we are back in the age of pirates,
Yep.
of piracy. If you study the 16th and 17th century, of how obviously before the Treaty of Westphalia and before the Peace of Westphalia, and setting up some kind of international law to regulate our relationship with each other as countries. When pirates reigned supreme and it was might is right, it's terrifying what similarities we have today. You go in, take the leader of another country, take him away. You want to say, oh, Cuba. I have to decide what I'm going to do with Cuba, but I'll take it over. There's Nicaragua. There are other countries which I will dispose of as I want to. I mean that this is frightening. It's taking us back.
The mind-boggling thing to me is that it's still possible to portray this in the Western general public as just part of the rules-based international order. I mean, there's still enough people who believe this. I think they're getting less, but there's
I
still
think
enough
so.
who actually go like, no, overall we're still the good guys. How long will you
Yes.
still believe that? Well. My friend, thank you very much, Evarist. That was a very good
Thank you very much.
discussion and very important observations about these states. So people who want to follow you, they should can find you in the Times of Malta, right? That's where you regularly
Yes,
publish.
yes. And as I told you last time, I hope that by the time we meet again, I'll have my own Substack as well.
Waiting for that, and we will certainly make an episode once the first article is out, so I can send people over there. Until then, Evarist Bartolo, thank you very
Thank
much
you
for your
very
time
much.
today.
Thank you. All the best.